Good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History, which is the collaborative home for 5 partner organizations that together form the largest archive on the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. I would like to thank one of those partner organizations, the Leo Baeck Institute, for co-sponsoring tonight's event. And thanks to all of you for logging in this evening. A few just housekeeping items before we get started. You'll notice the chat is disabled for participants, so please put your questions in the Q&A box. No need to raise your hand. We'll get to the questions at the end, but you can type them in as we go along. Today's program is being recorded and should be available on the center's webpage and YouTube page within a few weeks. And since you registered for this event, you'll receive an email with the link to the recording. If you'd like to see the automated live captions for this program and you're not currently seeing them, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We will wrap up tonight's program within about an hour. I'll have a conversation with the author about his book. We'll look at some pictures and then he'll take your questions. So let me get started. I will introduce tonight's author. Alexander Wolff spent 36 years on staff at Sports Illustrated. He is author or editor of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Raw Recruits and Big Game, Small World, which was named a New York Times notable book. A former Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton, he lives with his family in Vermont. Tonight, we'll be discussing his latest book, which, sorry for the blur, which is Endpapers, a family story of books, war, escape, and home. So thank you for being here, Alex.
Thanks for having me, Lauren.
Let's jump right in. As people can hear from your bio, you spent most of your professional life as a sports journalist. So when and why did you decide to write this story? And I know we have some pictures we can look at while we're talking, so we can get that slideshow going as well.
Yeah, so I suppose the story in a nutshell, this was a subhead on a review in the New York Review of Books that oversimplifies it somewhat, but a grandfather who fled the Nazis and a father who fought for them. And I'd always been aware of the general contours of this story in my family's past. But I think it was in 1996 when my dad, suffering from cancer, invited me to go for a cruise down the Danube. And during the course of that cruise, we would have these long discussions and I would take notes. And at one point, my dad turned to me and said, maybe you'll write about this someday. And I don't mention that in the book per se, but I will say that during the course of working on it, those words echoed. I mean, I felt there was a kind of permission given. And most of us know that whether it should or not, what our parents think sometimes carries some sway over us as we go through our adult lives. But fast forward from 96, my dad dies in 2007. And then by 2016, journalism in general, print journalism, Sports Illustrated, going through rough times. They're culling the herd of writers. I took a buyout and decided it was time to turn to this. And I uprooted the family, my wife, 2 kids. We moved to Berlin, more or less on spec, thinking, oh, there might be a story to be told here. A lot of cousins still live over there. And I realized very quickly once I arrived in Berlin that this would have been in 2017, the middle of 2017, that my family was just, they were literary people. They wrote letters, they made notations and diaries, they left a real paper trail. The photograph here is a photo my dad took, so it extended even to photographic trail. He loved to take pictures. He took this about a month after he turned 15 in 1936. And his mother was taking him on a tour of Germany, and this is in the city of Lübeck. My dad is the shadow in the foreground, and you can see the Nazi banners, this kind of generic hatted man up the sidewalk from him, looking a little like our vision of Franz Kafka, I suppose. So I had all this material to sift through, and in Berlin, I very quickly, 4 days after we arrived, Charlottesville happened. So suddenly I'm aware of what's going on, the context in which I'm doing this research, and being a journalist, what's happening in the present day is of interest to me too. So Charlottesville's happening on one side of the Atlantic, and Germany's about to have a very big election in September where the AfD, this far rightist party, is poised to make gains. So this was kind of a conspiracy of events that led me to take this all on. But it was kind of I felt I had to do it. And certainly once I dug into the material and saw how rich it was and had a better sense of the context in which I'd be doing that research, it seemed almost as if it was an obligation.
So what was your research process like? And maybe we can look at these slides full screen in slideshow mode, Moria.
Yeah, the process was really a two-track process. I mean, I had all this primary source material that was very personal from the family. My grandfather had been a book publisher in Germany before World War I. He had published Kafka, and then during the 1920s, German society changed drastically. The appetite for the kind of books that he would publish disappeared, but there was still a real paper trail. His letters are in archives on both sides of the Atlantic. So I would dig into the archives, read highly personal letters that my grandfather wrote with both his first wife, Elisabeth Merck, and his second wife, Helen Wolff. And but at the same time, in parallel to all that very personal stuff I'd be sifting through, I really didn't know the history in which all these events were taking place. So I would do this parallel reading. German Jewry is something I didn't really know. Amos Elon wrote a wonderful book called The Pity of It All. It's a survey, not particularly long, but gives a wonderful sense of the tragedy of German Jewry. I read that. Timothy Snyder wrote Bloodlands, his book about Hitler and Stalin and what happened in between. And it was kind of in the interplay between the primary material and some of that secondary material that the tumblers sort of fell into place. I'll give you an example. I didn't know that the Nazis had hatched the hunger plan, that this was part of the final solution, that as they went into the East through Poland and Ukraine and the Western Soviet Union, that the intention was to starve Jews and Slavs and Soviet prisoners, and that soldiers would live off the land, and that any surplus food would be sent back to the Reich to feed the populace. And then I read my dad's letters home to his mother in Munich during the war. So he's deployed, he's part of the invasion of the Soviet Union. And in reading these letters, I see him talking constantly about how well he is eating. Portuguese sardines and olive oil, fried potatoes. And then to read Snyder and to understand what's going on around the movements of the Wehrmacht into the East, it was made a huge impression on me. I'd been raised, like I'm sure many people, to think of the Holocaust as something that happened in camps in the woods and not as part of this ritualized starvation. And it made a huge impression on me. So as the months progressed, comparing what I was reading in the histories, and sometimes it wasn't just history books, sometimes it was biographies or memoirs, even fiction. A wonderful novel about Varian Fry, set in Marseille, about his efforts.
Yeah, I did a book discussion of that one, the Julie Aranger book, right?
A wonderful book, and so rich. And Varian Fry figures in my grandparents' escape from Vichy France too, eventually. So, but that was my process. I took a desk in a co-working space in Berlin. I was easily the oldest person there, the least hip, but Berlin is just saturated with history. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm still seeing the first image. Are you seeing the second slide, Alex, or the first photo?
No, I'm still seeing the first slide. Yeah.
Okay. Moria, were you not able? I think she's having a little trouble on her end. So let me see. Maybe I will screen. You want to try it again, Moria? I'm sorry, Alex, because I want to make sure we get to see all the pictures. We're seeing the first slide. You know what? I have the slides as well. So let me try to screen share. Hold on a moment. Are you all seeing that?
I'm seeing it, yes.
And now the second slide?
Yeah, there's the second slide. And these are
Okay.
my father's letters back to Munich from the front. And he translated them all for my sisters and me before he died. So that was a great favor. But again, the power of reading just these details of daily life, how powerful they were alongside what I was reading in Snyder's Bloodlands in particular.
So you discovered a lot of interesting information about your ancestors when you were doing this research, including some illustrious German Jewish ancestors. So can you tell us about your third great grandfather, Baron, was it Moritz von Haber?
Yes, so here he is, actually a great times 7 or 8 uncle. It was his father that is our common ancestor. So his father, Solomon von Haber, was the Hofbankier, the court banker of Baden, beloved by the Grand Duke in Karlsruhe for how he managed the financial affairs of the Grand Duchy. And he had 11 children, and Moritz was one of them. And Moritz converted from Judaism, married in a Catholic marriage, and spent a lot of time tending to various business interests around Europe. But he also, the gossips had it, was carrying on an affair with the Grand Duchess, and it was said that he was the father of one of her daughters. And that and various other things ended up provoking the anti-Semitism of others in Baden, and he wound up getting into 2 duels, both of which he survived and which led to the deaths of other duelists. And one of them was tied up or led to riots in Karlsruhe and the storming of the Haber Palace in 1843. The irony of that is that his father Solomon had been chased from that same home back in 1819 in the Hep riots, a previous round of anti-Semitic rioting. This was totally unknown to me. I mean, I knew I had Jewish ancestors going back to the early part of the 19th century, and there is the Haber Palace, very close to the Ducal Palace in downtown Karlsruhe. But I had no idea that they were at the center of something that was in newspapers all over Europe at the time. So it added a kind of poignancy when I looked at my grandfather's having to flee in the following century because of his, not so much because of his Jewish ancestry, but more because he was a publisher of degenerate, so-called degenerate writers. There was a through line from what happened in Karlsruhe in 1843 all the way up to Kurt leaving right after the Reichstag fire.
So we will definitely talk a bit about, quite a bit about Kurt, your grandfather, but staying a little bit in the earlier period, on the non-Jewish side, your great-grandmother, Kurt's mother, was a Merck of the well-known pharmaceutical company. So can you talk a little bit about her and her family history?
Yeah, let me untangle that just a bit. So it was actually my dad's mother was Elisabeth Merck. So Kurt married her. So the dowry, there were 2 sources of the money that Kurt funded his publishing activities. One was Merck pharmaceutical money, decidedly non-Jewish family, but also on Kurt's mother's side, there was a great deal of wealth. And those were his Jewish ancestors. They were railroad barons, in addition to the von Habers who were established a number of factories. Solomon's offspring did that in Baden. But here you can see an ad for Merck from the early part of the 20th century for Oikedal, which is an opioid very similar to what we read about in the newspapers today. During the 1920s in Germany and throughout Europe, indeed Merck marketed throughout the world, people pop pills. It's sort of the beginning of that attitude that is so much a part of modern life. If you're feeling a little low or you need to pick me up, you pop a pill. The Merck that we know of in the States was established by a distant cousin of mine who emigrated back in the late 19th century. And then interestingly, with World War I, Congress passed the Trading with the Enemy Act, and the US government actually expropriated from my closer German Merck relatives, the US Merck. So these 2 Mercks have existed since World War I separately. They have cordial relations. Family members are related, but they're two very different companies. And the German Mercks, I would come to find out, had ties to the Third Reich. So this is Elisabeth Merck, my grandmother, as painted by Felice Casorati, this Italian portrait painter, during the mid-20s, which was a point at which Kurt's publishing activities had wound down a fair enough. I might talk briefly about that. So with that dowry he got, he founded the Kurt Wolff Verlag in Leipzig, which was the center of the German publishing industry. There he is, as painted by the same Italian artist. And given the tenor of the time, so this would have been very early 1900s, Expressionism was all the rage. So he was publishing and had as readers on his editorial staff people like Franz Werfel. Famously, Franz Kafka, before World War I broke out, walked into his publishing office in Leipzig, and very soon he was publishing Kafka. Eventually he would publish Joseph Roth, wonderful writers, but clearly Heinrich Mann, for instance, whom he published, wrote a novel during World War I called The Loyal Subject, which was a send-up and criticism of the monarchy and blind patriotism, all these things that Kurt knew could not possibly be published during the war because of the censors. So he waited patiently, and as soon as the war ended, he published The Loyal Subject, Der Untertan. But then very, very quickly, there was both the Weimar hyperinflation, which ruined all sorts of businesses, not just book publishing, but also just the cultural circumstances were such that nobody was interested in experimental writing. Kurt published a lot of sumptuous art books. He loved art, and people just didn't have the disposable income to buy fancy art books. So steadily through the 20s, his business failed, and by 1930 or so, he was divorced. My dad and his sister were now living in Munich with Elisabeth, and Kurt soon remarried Helen Wolff. They were living in the south of France and then in Italy. And in 1933, they moved to Berlin, where he hopes, before Hitler takes over, he hopes to find a job in the cultural department of the German government, still the Weimar Republic. But as soon as the Reichstag fire takes place, within 48 hours, he and Helen are in London. They listened to Goering ranting on the radio. Kurt turned to Helen and said, "These are madmen, pack," and they're out of there. And he was what was known as a Gesinnungsemmigrant, so he was an immigrant of conviction. He wasn't someone who was actually deported, but he could read the tea leaves well enough.
And meanwhile, your father and aunt were still back in Germany with their mother, correct?
Right. So in 1933, my dad, who was born in 21, is still not even a teenager. And he goes off to boarding school, and the educational environment in which he is raised is becoming steadily Nazified. Mm-hmm. And by the time my grandfather and Helen emigrate with Varian Fry's help through Marseille and then over the Spanish border and out Lisbon on a boat, arriving in March of 41, my dad has participated in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Again, doing that two-track thing, when I was on that personal letter track, lining up where the postmarks and the dates on the letters were, I could see these spectacular juxtapositions of Helen and Kurt arriving in New York, obviously destitute but free, and my dad on the Russian front.
And you also discovered in your research that there were some extremely zealous Nazis in your own family. Can you talk a little bit about what you uncovered there?
That's exactly right. I mean, one of the things that was a great help to me is that as part of a sort of radical transparency in Germany now, Merck, as part of its 350th anniversary, commissioned 4 independent historians to put together an unvarnished history of the company. And in there, you can learn about a great aunt who, over 60 or 70 years, kept a detailed diary and was essentially Heinrich Himmler's pen pal. And she offered to give her Darmstadt mansion to the Ahnenerbe, which was one of Himmler's pet projects. It was supposed to be a kind of a curation of so-called Aryan art and Aryan history. She wrote plays that were dedicated to Himmler. She was a little bit of the crazy aunt in the attic everybody else in the family wanted to say, but come to find out, Karl Merck, who was actually running the company during the Third Reich, was not only a Nazi Party member, but a fervent enough Nazi that he went underground as soon as the Americans took Darmstadt. So in this picture, you can see my grandparents, Kurt on the left in the background, and Elisabeth, my grandmother, on the right. And at the wheel of this car, the symbolism is hard to miss, is Elisabeth's brother, Wilhelm. This is my dad's favorite uncle. And all my dad really told me about him was that he loved to race cars. No accident that he's sitting in one. But it turns out he also was a member of the SS. And there were people who came and claimed mitigating circumstances on his behalf at his tribunal during the denazification process after the war. But he was still part of the directorate at Merck, and Merck was playing the Horst Wessel song at company gatherings and probably most directly involved in the war effort in producing rocket fuel that was used. And this is all in this corporate history that Merck itself has ordered up. And in fact, the historians conclude that if the extent of Merck's involvement with the Nazi war machine had been known at the time, that the Allies probably would have insisted on the decommissioning of the company. And as it was, as in so many cases right after the war, the Allies found it expedient to keep companies like Merck in the hands of more conservative people who would be more reliable as the Cold War began to ramp up.
And as you mentioned, despite his Jewish heritage, your father was 1/4 Jewish, so that was second-degree Michelin by Nazi standards. He fought in the German army. So can you talk a little bit about that, or how common that was?
It was much more common than I had any idea. There's a book by Brian Mark Rigg, called Hitler's Jewish Soldiers, that asserts that there were perhaps 150,000 soldiers of Jewish descent who fought for Hitler. And what that underscores, if nothing else, was just how thoroughly integrated and assimilated German Jews were in German society. And many of these were people who had family members who could be traced back to World War I who had served then, or they themselves had served. So my father did not identify as Jewish. You'd have to go back to about 1830 to find an ancestor who actually identified as Jewish. There were so many conversions and baptisms because, as in the case of many German Jews, the great affection for German culture and for the language led many of them to live these very assimilated lives or aspire to it. So my dad grew up, particularly after the divorce, in a very Christian home. But the irony, I was never kept in the dark about the fact that we had Jewish ancestors. As long as I can remember, my dad talked about his grandmother, Kurt's mother, who was Jewish, she wasn't Jewish in that she had converted, but her ancestors were the Jewish forebears through which so much of the family's wealth, and indeed Kurt becoming a publisher, had been made possible by.
Do you know if he felt conflicted in this role as a German soldier?
I think my dad's source of confliction would have stemmed more from him having come out of this environment of kind of high culture, the Bildungsbürgertum, which included many Jewish Germans. But art, music, and books were very much at odds with the militarism that was going on. Indeed, one of the great tragedies of German history is how the Bildungsbürgertum, Jewish and non-Jewish, just kind of crashed on the shoals of Nazism in the Third Reich. So my dad was a pacifist, and even more, of course, one after he came to the US and could talk and survey that entire experience he had. But like so many people, like his own father, who went to war in World War I thinking it was this glorious enterprise, reading Kurt's World War I diary, which is in the German Literary Archive outside Stuttgart, You can see this evolution in Kurt's thinking. Gee, this war will be wonderful. We'll destroy our enemies. We'll be united as a country. And then within 10, 12 months or so, his diary reflects this just complete souring on it all. My dad went through that same process, but there's no conscientious objection in Nazi Germany.
And of course, no matter how assimilated the German Jews were, that didn't like save them from the Nazis. But I think I had read that a Jew who was a one-quarter Jew who was not, who didn't identify as Jewish and wasn't married to a Jew was just, you know, non-Jewish enough to be acceptable. So I guess by those standards, he just slipped in.
That's exactly right. So this is all traceable to the 1935 Nuremberg laws, and you were, I believe, by dint of those laws, you were decreed not to be part of the German race and nation as the Nazis defined it, but you were still considered German enough to be put in a uniform and sent off to war. And the book by Rigg, Hitler's German Soldiers, describes in great detail how they did cull some of these Mischlinge, as the Nazis called them, during the war, as they felt more secure in doing so. And it's Rigg's contention that if the Nazis had won, that most of these 150,000 would have been liquidated or excluded or deported, been treated in much the same way that those who didn't wear uniforms had been treated.
And back to your grandfather for a moment. After coming to the US, he went back into publishing and founded Pantheon Books, which has a pretty illustrious history. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, maybe we can move on to the next slide. This is a photo, by the way, taken in Ukraine. My father is the second from the right with his unit. But yeah, so the experience of Kurt was so radically different when he and Helen landed in the States. Within a year, they had somehow wrestled up enough money to start Pantheon Books. One of the early investors was George W. Merck, a first cousin of my grandmother's and part of the American Mercks who had emigrated in the late 19th century. But because they were technically enemy aliens, Kurt and Helen thought it would be best not to be in management positions on the founding documents of Pantheon, and this would cause them some problems down the road. So their first publications were Franz Mazurel, who's the Belgian artist whose woodcut is on the cover of Endpapers. And then they did an edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales in English translation, both of which did pretty well. But it was in the late 50s that they really had a breakthrough with Anne Morrow Lindbergh's Gift from the Sea and then Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. And the breakthrough was a double-edged sword. It led to enormous influx of cash. Pantheon's reputation in the New York publishing world leapt as a result. But the board of Pantheon felt that doing a lot of the literary publishing that Kurt and Helen were insistent on doing was basically leaving a lot of money on the table, that they ought to be doing more of these bestsellers. Never mind that the Pasternak novel, that one of the salespeople in the house said, "Oh, Russian novels never sell." That was his famous pronouncement on something that would sell more than 1 million worldwide. So there was a boardroom clash. And to me, that's one of the most poignant things about the story that I was to discover, which is that you have somebody who comes to the States as a refugee and is this rather remarkable success story, bootstrapping his way, founding this publishing house. But because he's a refugee, it's not really his company, his business. And indeed, Helen and Kurt were so scarred by this experience, this boardroom battle that they lost, that they re-emigrate back to Europe and live out the final years in Switzerland. So in that way, Kurt's experience is very similar to both Brecht and Thomas Mann, who came to the States and then found the political circumstances to be such that they had to flee back to Europe.
I know most of the book is about your father, grandfather, and their ancestors, but you do talk a little bit in the book about your mother's side of the family as well, and her the person in her family that inspired you while you were writing this story, if you want to talk about her a little.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a digression in the book, but it seemed germane. This is Caroline Faraday. Some of you may have read a book called Lilac Girls. It was a novel that came out, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And it's about Caroline. It's a fictionalized story about her. She was this wealthy former actress who'd become a philanthropist, never married, lived on her Connecticut estate and cultivated her lilacs there. But she took an enormous interest, largely out of her Francophilia, in supporting the Allied cause. And after the war, took up the cause of the Polish women in Ravensbrück who had been the subject of all sorts of gruesome experiments by Nazi doctors. And she fundraised and spearheaded a movement to bring these Polish women to the United States, where they received treatment. And one of the things about Caroline that struck me is that there's a town in Louisiana called Faraday, and it's named after her family. And they were slave owners at a huge plantation in Louisiana. And it looked to me that Caroline was living a life to try to atone for her slaveholding ancestors. And while I was working on Endpapers, I read Lilac Girls, but I also read a book, and maybe she's been part of your programming too, Lauren, by Susan Neiman, called Learning from the Germans. Susan's a political philosopher who's based in Berlin, but she's also American, Jewish, grew up in the Deep South, and was born in Atlanta. And her book is this fascinating toggling back and forth between the way Germany has reckoned or tried to reckon with its past and what we have done and not done in the States with slavery and racial violence. And Caroline just seemed to be a character I needed to rope into my story because she enlarged it, and she brought up some of these issues that I, as an American and whose mother is part of this lineage that goes back to slaveholders in Louisiana, I felt this responsibility to look at.
You mentioned something about the print that's used on the cover of the book. I had a question also about the title. I know that authors don't always get to choose their own title. So did you have input into this title, Endpapers, and what does it mean to you?
Yes, I mean, the short answer is I did, but the credit for the title goes to my wonderful editor, Peter Blackstock at Grove Atlantic. I had gone to Berlin thinking that the book would be called Berlin Reckoning. I just felt that Berlin had such resonance as a place of history. And I felt reckoning was what I was trying to do. Reckoning with my family, the past, coming to terms with where we were in the world today and how this historical story fed into it. But then with about a week to 10 days before the book was going to be shipped to the printers, or at least the cover was going to be finalized, Peter asked me if maybe there weren't something that alluded to books that could serve on multiple levels as a title. And he threw out 6 or 7 kind of literary terms. And if our participants tonight are aware, but the Endpapers are essentially they're the parts of a book that bind the hardcover to the innards, to the paper innards. And when Kurt published books, frequently the Endpapers would be decorative. They would be works of art in themselves. But I love the word because it has that sense of reckoning or summing up or valediction, and also kind of had that literary feel to it. And unfortunately, the German word doesn't quite work for a title in German. The Vorsatzblätter, sort of resolution pages, but resolution does kind of get at what I'm trying to do here, reckoning or summing up. And I've always been a fan of portmanteau words where you have two that are stuck together and they're sort of stronger in unison.
You said the Germans came up with a different title entirely, right?
They did. The book was published in the fall in Germany as Das Land meiner Väter, which means land of my fathers. So clearly not so much a literary title. And I suspect that's because people in Germany already knew about Kurt and his activities over there, and they were trying to position the book over there a little bit more as a German-American story and immigration. And but I'm very, very happy. And I think the image on the cover, which we see as Kurt used it in 1927 on a book catalog of his from Mozzarella, is just the man on the ladder, discovering things. You crack open books, you rifle your way through archives, you read letters that haven't been picked up in a century, and you're going to have a little starburst of realization.
You mentioned that your father never hid your Jewish heritage from you, so it's something you've known your whole life. So what has that been like? Is there any Jewish feeling or connections in your family today? I know it's a bit removed, but.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is no, simply because in 1830 is when I could last find a self-identifying Jewish forebear. But it's very interesting. A rabbi in Montreal read the book and asked me, and in the book I talk about trying to go back to my German roots, and he asked me whether I was going to go back and explore my Jewish roots. And of course, a big part of this book has been that. But I mentioned this to a correspondent from Die Welt, whom I spoke to, who's an Austrian Jew. And he said, it's sort of a false premise that Germans are Jews, that those ancestors of mine who in the early 1800s were helping to turn Baden into this prosperous duchy. Some of them were wine merchants, and some of them factory owners, and some of them built railroads between Rhineland cities. They made Germany, and they were Jewish. And I'm reminded when I think of how close Germany came to becoming a democracy in mid-century, the mid-19th century, in 1848, in the Frankfurter Parliament, and that German Jews were a huge part of that. And of course, the intervening history has been so tragic and catastrophic. But I was cheered to hear that from Hannes Stein from Die Welt, who told me that. He said, if you go through, that France has La France profonde, this small towns and so forth. And he said, you should go for a wander in these small German towns, and you can see and touch and feel the landscape that your Jewish forebears helped to make. So I think in that sense, and certainly in the sense of art and music and books and Bildung, that was something that united Germans who were Jewish and non-Jewish alike during that period of time up until the 30s, when it was possible. So I think in that sense, I identify as culturally philo-Semitic, if that makes any sense at all, but it's a terrific question, and I think about it often.
We're going to move to questions from the audience just after one more question. So if you haven't typed your question in yet, please do so. Just a question about your research. Were there any unsolved mysteries that remain, or anything you still want to pursue in your family story?
I asked on that Danube cruise, I asked my dad if he knew about the camps, and he said he didn't, and I'd like to believe him. He said he knew that there were camps, but death camps, no, he didn't know about the death camps. And I try to persuade myself that he was in this kind of limbo between the front and home, and just doing his job, that he wouldn't have known. I have been able to determine that when atrocities took place in the Ukraine, while he was in the Ukraine, he was not there. I know this because of the date and postmarks on his letters home. But just the same, I have this hunger to know what he knew, and I'll never know exactly what he knew. But I do know that he didn't want to talk about his time in the Ukraine. When a cousin of mine who was looking into it asked to speak to him, he spoke about other things, but he didn't really want to speak about that. And I wonder if something my aunt said about my dad when he came home from the war, about all the things he saw, there was just something post-traumatic about that. My dad was, once he came to the States, such a a classic 50s person. Was so grateful to be here. His father, who he might have held a grudge against for having abandoned him, did a great deal to help get him on his feet once he emigrated in 48. So he relentlessly looked forward, and we were raised, the three kids were raised to look forward. He didn't dodge questions when I asked them, but I didn't ask him beyond that one question about the camp. So that's the mystery that kind of hangs. What else might he have known, suppressed, kept secret? But this is all about silence. I mean, it's been about silence in Germany for so many years. And I shouldn't be surprised that my particular angle into this would be met with silence in some places too. So there are these empty spaces.
And what about your suburban neighbors and his friends? Was there just a polite silence, or did people ask about his experiences?
You know, my dad once said he was kind of amazed at how infrequently he was asked or pressed about his experience in the war. And again, I think it has a lot to do with just the cultural space we were all in as a country in the 50s. Even Helen and Kurt, when they came over, you know, in very different circumstances, they were refugees. They were amazed that people didn't want to know their stories of flight and survival and getting berths on that ship out of Lisbon, and how dodgy it had been when they left Paris. And so Americans have their blinkers on frequently, and even today, I think in many respects, which is just another reason I'm glad I took the time to write the book.
Let's go to some questions from viewers. The first question I see is, how did your father's favorite uncle look upon your dad once the war started?
How did my father's favorite uncle look upon my dad once the war started?
I wonder, I mean, your dad is the one who served in the German army. She may be asking about your grandfather, who was in exile at that point, but you could answer for either or both.
Yeah. Well, certainly Kurt, there's certainly nothing in any of the letters or diaries that suggests that Kurt held it against my dad for being conscripted by a totalitarian regime to serve in their military. And my dad was 18 when he was drummed into the Wehrmacht. So I guess my dad might have been entitled more to wonder why Kurt, in fleeing into exile, hadn't thought to go scoop my dad and his sister up and take them with him. I have a much better understanding of why that didn't happen now. You know, I think there was a real sense of security. This was a very prosperous Aryan family that they were living in. There certainly was no sense at that time that the Third Reich was not going to win this struggle. But yeah, those are the two reactions I would have. I guess I would kind of
question about the not the very zealous Nazi uncle's reactions to your family.
Yeah, and him, the Uncle Wilhelm, my dad never told me anything about Wilhelm's Nazi associations. I discovered that in an archive in Berlin. And if I knew about his position with the company, if I knew more about Merck and its relationship with the Third Reich, I probably could have, should have intuited long ago that he would have been with the regime. But I did not know that. And my dad would only talk about Uncle Wilhelm in the context of him having raced cars and making these visits to Darmstadt when he was a little boy and getting behind the wheel. So it was very much, you know, there's a book by Sebastian Hafner about the mentality of the German people during that era. And he talks about how the Nazis turned Germany into a giant sports club. And the idea that the Berlin Olympics in 36 or racing cars fast, I mean, even today, the Germans don't have speed limits on the Autobahn. There is something kind of unbridled Germanness that has to do with competition and sports. It's not an appealing thing, but it's something that Wilhelm really tapped into. And he also liked to fly gliders. And But at the same time, interestingly enough, my dad's stepfather, who played the violin and was an amateur musician and an obstetrician, and actually served as Rudolf Hess's wife's OBGYN, come to find out. He also, he wasn't a member of the SS, but he would make donations to the SS, which a lot of prominent Germans who didn't want the stigma of being a party member, I'm too civilized for that, but they wanted the protection. So they would make these donations as supporting members, Födenes Mitglied der SS, and he was one of them. And my dad adored him too. So these were the men in my father's life when he was growing up.
Here's a question. What was the impact on your family concerning the scholarly debate of Historikerstreit? Sorry, my German's not very good. In the late 1980s, questions of reconciling contemporary German historiography with its past of Nazism and the Holocaust.
I'm afraid that might be above my pay grade and certainly above members of my family's pay grade. I will say that there was a very influential exhibit that was staged in Hamburg during I believe it was in the 1990s, that made it clear to the German people that the Wehrmacht had been party to the atrocities during the war, that it had not only been the security police and the SS that had committed them, that the Wehrmacht facilitated and was frequently involved. And this shattered a myth that modern Germans had nursed along, I think, in the hope of protecting some of their parents and uncles and so forth. And my dad died before I could ask him about that. That became a thing in Germany, unbeknownst to me. And I wonder if he knew about it at the time. Again, to the best of my ability, I tried to satisfy myself that he had not been present where atrocities took place in the East. And that doesn't mean there weren't horrible things that he saw, but he did tell me that he never killed anyone during the course of the war, to his knowledge.
There is a question about, was your dad's unit involved in atrocities? But I think you just answered that, not to your knowledge, or not related.
I haven't seen any evidence of it. But I guess that's why the mystery to me is more, what did my dad know and how much did it weigh on him as he went through the rest of his life? And I feel some relief in knowing that, but the interconnectedness of implication is just it's such a web that gets spun, particularly in a totalitarian society, that of course my father was implicated. And Günter Grass in his memoir writes about this, that there's just no way to escape it. And Grass has plenty of gray areas and his reputation has suffered in the last 10 to 15 years or so, but I think that point he makes applies to my father too.
Has doing this research changed your belief in God or your non-belief in God? In what way?
I haven't given it that thought, but I have thought about my father, who had very little use for organized religion. And perhaps it was seeing what happened with the Protestant church in Germany as he was growing up, and society became Nazified and the Gleichschaltung took place, which was there was the confessing church, and that there was a German church, and the German church basically went arm in arm with Nazism. And I would be very cynical about organized religion if I had witnessed that. At the same time, we do know that there were very brave people like Niemöller and Bonhoeffer, and we venerate them today. But I think my dad was actually became a militant secularist as a result of what he witnessed, just how fragile democracy is. And he's a great champion of American democracy, and I think he would be deeply troubled by a lot of the things that are going on today. So I have my own beliefs. I, I, I do have some spiritual beliefs, but when I think of my dad, I'm always considering his particular take on organized religion, or certainly Christianity's response to what happened in Europe during the 1930s.
I don't know if this is an answerable question, but how do you resolve the paradox of German Jews being so loyal to the fatherland and highly assimilated, exemplary achievers, and in the arts and culture, and then how do you square that with the outcome of the Holocaust?
It's irreconcilable, and and when I think of the Amos Elon book, The Pity of It All, I mean, that title almost speaks to it. Fritz Stern in his memoir, the great historian, Five Germanys I Have Known. I feel like I'm giving a reading list here, but there were so many wonderful books I got lost in as I was working on this, and Stern talks about that. Just the tragedy of wanting so desperately to belong to this culture, believing in it. I was struck walking through the Jewish Museum in Berlin and seeing this huge poster of Goethe, a portrait of Goethe, and the panel of text next to it said, this may seem odd, but Goethe was beloved by German Jews because he was a polymath, because he used the German language so beautifully. And I guess I circle back a little bit to Kafka. There's so many scholars who said, oh, he foreshadowed what happened. But I think the Kafka's ability to play with, to find the perfect expression of what he had to say in the German language, I think is a wonderful example of how Jews and Jewish culture has a home in that language. And, that your co-presenter tonight, the Leo Baeck Institute, is standing up for German Jewry and what it means. It's so important that what the Germans did to Jewry and Jewish culture and Jewish people not eclipse or obliterate what it is that Jews have done with the language. And I talked to Hannes Stein of Die Welt about this at length, and we agreed. And there is, in Berlin particularly, there's this kind of fusion of Jewish life and the German language that I noticed immediately, and I can only applaud.
There's a question or a comparison to Denmark saying that the Danes, I guess, saved their Jews because Jews were so much a part of society that religion didn't matter, and wondering why that didn't happen in Germany, where they were also so assimilated. I don't know if that's a question that can be answered either. Yeah.
No, Denmark was definitely exceptional in some ways. And the audacity of what the Nazis did, because of that they thought they could root out, and that they did, people who were so assimilated. And that was, and many people have pointed this out, there were German Jews who stayed deep into the late 30s and even the early 40s because they just refused to believe that this country that had produced all these things they so loved, that they indeed themselves had produced all these great works of culture and art and music and literature, or fought in World War I for the Kaiser, that surely they would not turn on us. And they had a bureaucracy that was finding ways to do that, in spite of all those decades and centuries of assimilation.
There's a couple of questions about your experience living in Berlin. Was it difficult to adjust? And how did living there influence you and manifested itself upon your return to the US? And was it difficult to find people to talk to about your family?
Yeah, the actual experience in Berlin was really rewarding. I was very lucky to find an ABD, all but dissertation, American woman, Deborah Cohen, who teaches German instruction, mostly to Americans, right in mind for her usual hourly rate to work with me on translations of these family letters and so forth. So I had not only a deaf translator on my shoulder as I tried to make sense of these things, but also somebody who really understood the history and knew her way around search engine. So that was great. But just generally, Berlin has this this quality. I mean, history is just there, literally in the walls of buildings. The Stolpersteine, which I write about, and I'm sure many people are familiar, in the sidewalks. And the Germans today are obsessive about talking about these things. I mean, their debates take place in public about propriety of a particular Denkmal or a Gedenkstätte, and they make these fine distinctions between a monument and a place of reflection and all the various ways that public memory is engaged. And I think what I took back from Berlin was this deep desire that in the States we could find a way to do something similar. And I think the closest we've come to is probably down in Montgomery, Alabama, where Brian Stevenson has started his Equal Justice Initiative. And in the same way that the Stolpersteine are embedded in sidewalks outside of buildings that have meaning to the people, the lives of the people who are memorialized in those little brass plaques, what Stevenson is doing with victims of lynching is taking the actual soil from where lynching took place and storing it at his memorial. And then people can come from the place, bring the soil back, and have some sort of a group discussion or commemorative event before reinterring that soil in the spot to sort of sanctify it. And it's that kind of thinking that I would love to see more of in the States, because the Germans, Susan Neiman says we can learn from them. A lot of her German friends are mortified that she would use that particular construction as the title of her book. But I do think there are things that are going on in the public sphere in Germany and have been going on that would be worthwhile for us to learn from.
Okay, there's a question from someone who wants to write about his own father and is wondering if you had any difficulty keeping yourself and your wonderment about him out of your writing.
Oh, don't even try not to succumb to that urge, because it's a constant dialogue. I mean, with my parents, my dad especially, even though he died back in 2007, I'm asking him questions. I'm wondering what he would think. And my mom told me, she lived another 4 years after he died, that she would do it all the time. And it's okay. It's necessary in a way. You don't necessarily have to put that in the finished product, your manuscript, but go through the process, because it will lead you places. And just trying to put myself in the shoes of both my dad and my grandfather was a big part of this. And then maybe reserve judgment for later, try to understand and then judge in that order. And if you can disentangle some of those fraught things that children and their parents always seem to have, do that to the best of your ability, but don't try to put up some impermeable wall.
Someone is asking if they can get a reading list of the books that you mentioned. So maybe I'll give you my email and then reach out to me, and I can get a list from Alex. My email is lgilbert@cjh.org. Let me put that in the chat. Or you can also just hit reply to any emails you got from the center about the program. That goes to a program's email that I can also see. So if you're interested in any further information or the list of books, if you remember all the books you mentioned, Alex, we could probably put that list together for you. We're coming up on an hour, and there's so much more that we could touch on in this conversation. And the book has so many interesting side stories and interesting relatives that we couldn't, you didn't have time to mention. And it's a really beautifully written book. And you mentioned, Alex, that the paperback is coming out in March?
March 15th, yeah. In Britain, it comes out March 3rd, and here it'll be March 15th.
Okay, so that can be pre-ordered, and the hardcover, of course, is also available. So thank you very much for joining me for tonight's conversation, and thanks to the Leo Baeck Institute and to everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right, have a good night. Thanks. Bye.